Hey guys, Fox here. And today we're going to be doing the fourth installment of the biggest USFL draft bust videos. And yes, we are doing a fourth. So, something that people might not know is that despite the fact that the USFL only played 3 years, they actually did have four drafts, as the league didn't actually suspend its services till after they did the draft for the '86 season, which naturally was the season they were playing in the fall. So in another way, this was the first draft that the USFL did that actually took place after the NFL draft. All the other ones pretty much came before the NFL draft, and then like at the same time the territorial drafts, which is because the USFL did that every single year. So the '86 is a very unique one in that sense that it was the only one after the NFL, and players didn't end up going to the USFL. So the rules are a bit different, except for the main one is that it's based literally just on what did in the NFL, which as a forewarning, pretty much all these guys almost only played in the NFL except for like one exception. But even then, he still played in the NFL a bit. So it's only based on what they did in the NFL. And then there's only one other rule. They had to have been a first round pick. That's it. There weren't as many picks. There were only 8 selections in this draft, as a lot of the teams, naturally folded or merged with other teams due to the fact that they're going in the fall. So that's pretty much it for this one. So without further ado, let's get started with the players. With the first overall pick in the 1986 USFL draft, the Orlando Renegades selected Mike Haight. Put simply, he was an offensive lineman who was drafted as a tackle by the USFL, but ended up playing guard. He was pretty much able to do both. But really, the thing with him, he wouldn't end up being a superstar type lineman. He ended up being a first round pick in the NFL, a month before. He's a 22nd overall pick by the Jets. He did not end up being what you expect of a first round pick lineman, as you hope he becomes, a Pro Bowler and a very consistent starter. He was a decent starter. He did start 43 games and play in 63. He was in the league until 1992, so he did play 7 years. So he wasn't, as an awesome pick as what he did in the NFL, but he was still a very solid player, all things considered. He's definitely not up for the biggest bust, as he is basically your prototypical, you just got a solid, decent lineman to have on your team for a few years, which you never really can go wrong with that. With the second overall pick in the 1986 USFL draft, the Arizona Outlaws selected Tony Casillas. Casillas was an offensive lineman. He was mainly a defensive tackle, nose tackle type player. And in terms of his career, he was picked second overall by the Atlanta Falcons, and coincidentally enough, second overall in the USFL draft as well. To put it simply, he was really solid. He wasn't, the most insane defensive tackle, but the guy was a second-team All-Pro once. He was an All-Rookie team member. He was very solid. He played in the Falcons for about 5 years, then he went to the Cowboys for a couple, and then he would end up going to the Jets and then back to the Cowboys. Thing is, he did help get two Super Bowl wins for the Cowboys. And overall, he was a solid player. He ended up getting 23 sacks, which isn't a ton, but was still solid. The guy had a lot of tackles as well. For a defensive lineman, especially just a nose tackle, the dude was great in Atlanta. For the first 4 years of his career, 3 of them he had 100 tackles, and 1 of them he had 150. That's what you expect linebackers to get, let alone defensive tackles. Very solid player. Better than Mike Haight, and definitely not the biggest bust. With the third overall pick in the '86 draft, the Jacksonville Bulls select wide receiver Bob Thompson or Robert Thompson. This is up there. This is up there for the biggest bust. To put it simply, I don't even think he's on either of these pictures, and I tried for a long time to find any image of him. He played for Youngstown University or Youngstown State. He ended up getting drafted in '86 in the 6th round. He wouldn't even play in the NFL in '86. He would have to wait till '87, and even then he'd only appear in 2 games, not doing really anything. To put it simply, there's not much else to say about this guy. When you can't find a picture of a guy at all, and then when all you did in the NFL was play 2 games and did nothing, yeah, he was a 6th round pick in the NFL. I don't know what made him go so high in the USFL. He must have, had something about him that made people think he was going to be great at stuff, but he wasn't. Definitely a bad pick. With the 4th overall pick, the Memphis Showboats selected Jim Everett. A lot of the times, quarterbacks don't really get high in the USFL drafts. As I said, the USFL territory drafts, and that's why a lot of quarterbacks go. But this year, the Showboats selected Jim Everett, and he was a very solid pick. In the NFL, he ended up he was the 3rd overall pick. He would play for about 12 years in the league, most of them with the Rams. With the Rams, he ended up leading the league in touchdowns twice. He was an all-rookie team member and a Pro Bowl in 1990. Very solid player. The guy ended up getting over 34,000 yards passing and 200 passing touchdowns. As to put it simply, he was a very solid player. He wasn't that top tier quarterback, but he was a very solid option for some pretty decent Rams teams during that era. He was a very solid quarterback and was definitely a solid pick. With the 5th overall pick in the 86 draft, the New Jersey Generals selected wide receiver James Pruitt. Unlike the first receiver picked in this draft, this guy ended up doing stuff in the NFL. Granted, once again, it was a guy who was a late round pick in the NFL, as he was the 107th overall pick, who was picked in the 4th round. But in terms of what he did in his career, he played a long time. Now, sometimes he was only really practice squad, training camp, or special teams type of guy. And he did play in the CFL for a bit. But to put it simply, he did play in the NFL for about 5-6 years-ish. I mean, his career history is kind of weird to find, but the bottom line is the dude in the NFL was decent, not great. He was your prototypical late-round pick receiver who would basically get in a few snaps and, make the most of his time. He had 1,000 yards in his career despite, actually having played games in the NFL for 6 years. But that being said, he was usually that, rotation type guy. So, in terms of if you were a USFL and you look at it as a top 5 pick, that's insane. But the guy was a 4th round pick in the NFL and overall is not the worst receiver taken in this draft. So he is safe from being the biggest bust, and the Generals are safe from having drafted the biggest bust. With the 6th overall pick in the 1986 USFL draft, the Birmingham Stallions selected running back Reggie Dupard. To put it simply, Reggie would end up being basically like a James Pruitt, except at the running back position, except that he in the NFL was actually a top pick. He was a 1st round pick by the Patriots. Remember, that year the Patriots in 86, this is the year right after they had just gotten to the Super Bowl and, gotten completely steamrolled by the Bears. So the Super Bowl, or the AFC defending champions, drafted this guy who in theory should have helped them, continue their success, but no, he didn't. He only ended up having 1,000 career yards, and that's combining both receiving and rushing. The dude only rushed for more than 200 yards once. In terms of combined yardage, he only had more than 200 yards twice. That's insane for a 1st round pick running back. Overall, in terms of an NFL sense, he was definitely a bust. But as we've mentioned before in this draft, he's not too bad to the point where he's the biggest bust of the draft. But overall, in terms of the NFL, he was definitely not as good as he was supposed to be, and definitely not what you expect out of a 1st round pick. With the 7th overall pick, the Baltimore Stars selected defensive tackle Eric Howard. To put it simply, this kind of selection is exactly why the Stars would have continued being such a good team and could have been good in the NFL if they emerged. Because, to put it simply, this was a very solid player. He only wasn't being a Pro Bowler once, but he had a couple very important plays for the Giants during his career, as he was a 2nd round pick. The dude played from 86 to 96. To play 11 years as a defensive tackle is pretty impressive. The dude was overall very solid. He ended up getting 33 career sacks in the regular season. He had 400 total tackles. But he was a very solid, nose tackle type player who definitely, if, the Stars had continued going, would have definitely helped make them, continue being the best team in the USFL by a mile. Very solid player, definitely not a bust. Awesome pick. And the last pick of the 1st round of the 1986 USFL draft was held by the Tampa Bay Bandits. They selected the 3rd receiver of this round in Ernest Givens. Despite being the last receiver taken, he was by far the best. By far. The dude was a 2nd round pick in the NFL, and man, was he good. He didn't even end up playing that long. He only played 10 years. With the Oilers, man, he was great. He was an all-rookie team member, a 2-time Pro Bowler, 2nd-team All-Pro. The guy had ended up getting 8,000 career receiving yards, which, as you know, is a very solid amount. And he actually had over 300 rushing yards, which, especially for, that time, you wouldn't expect a wide receiver to have. Nowadays, it's commonplace-ish for receivers to get good rushing yards if you go to their career sense, but not back then. Overall, very, very solid player. The guy ended up having, of 14.4 yards per reception. He ended up having 49 touchdowns. He only fumbled the ball. He did fumble 16 times, which is a bit more than you'd want. But overall, the dude was very, very solid, all things considered. To be the last receiver picked in that 1st round as well, so the Bandits definitely did get, if they had continued playing, definitely got the best one, as Ernest was the best receiver. And overall was probably, aside from maybe Jim Everett, the best player picked in this draft. He was a very, very, very solid pick. Definitely a great player and definitely not one of the biggest busts. So overall, in terms of who was the biggest bust, I hate when it's like this, but there's no debate. It's Robert Thompson / Bob Thompson, whatever you want to call him. By far his biggest bust. The bottom line is, to only play 2 games in your career and have it be not even in your rookie year is pretty sad. The Bulls definitely picked this wrong. Granted, maybe if the USFL had stayed, I mean, he definitely would have gone to the USFL. I mean, he'd go from a 6th-round pick to a third overall pick. Yeah, you definitely do that. But in terms of what he did in his career, it's not like he really did anything. He appeared in 2 games. Especially considering the fact that when you look at it in terms of when a player was drafted in the NFL versus when the USFL teams picked him, this is the biggest reach by far. I mean, they picked a dude that the NFL viewed as a 6th-round talent. And yes, we've talked about it before that NFL GMs have gotten it wrong and that USFL GMs were better in some cases. Like when the Stallions selected Jerry Rice number 1 overall versus, how the Niners ended up getting him in like the middle of the teens. Yeah, we get that. But this is something else. When you're a 6th-round pick, there's no way you should be a top pick in another league unless it's, literally like a new USFL or a new XFL where it's like, it's guys that are trying to, go to a new developmental type league. Nah, this was supposed to be legit competition, and the Jacksonville Bulls picked a guy who was picked in the 6th round. Not a good pick. And, hey, it ended up not being good. But overall, in terms of this last year of the USFL drafts, overall, it was decent. There weren't really that many players who you could look at and say were total busts. Aside from him, pretty much all these guys played multitudes of years and ranged anywhere from, just a solid, lineman, whether it be offense or defense, to a reliable, type of rotational receiver, and to, not so great backs. But overall, I mean, especially the last 2, I mean, Eric Howard, Ernest Givens, very solid picks. Jim Everett, great player overall. I mean, Tony Casillas was a very solid tackle. I mean, they had a lot of good players picked in this 1st round, which is definitely a good thing. So, this is pretty much it for almost all these. I will have one last video, which will come out some point naturally, where it's going to be looking at all the busts that we've covered so far and determining who the biggest one was in the USFL drafts. So, look out for that coming soon. As for me, this has been ZomFox. If you enjoyed this content, let me know as soon as I upload any videos. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and as always, have a great night.